Hey everyone, before we dive into today's episode, I just want to let you know that Cuberviews will be taking a short break for the holidays. We'll be back soon with new episodes starting January 8th. So thank you so much for the support. Enjoy the holiday season. We'll see you in the new year. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Hey everyone, welcome to episode 10 of Cuberviews. This is your host, Ian Braverman. Today I am joined by Keldan Campbell. We're going to be talking about his Bolt Cube. How are you doing today?
Doing good.
What happened today? Anything fun?
Nothing too crazy, just a work day. I guess I got some pumpkin pie baked for Thanksgiving.
Ooh, that sounds nice. Yeah, introduce yourself.
I'm Keldon. I mostly am known for curating an assortment of cubes as well as running the Washington Cube Champs event here in Seattle area. Those are my claims to fame.
Awesome. And how did you get into Magic and Cube?
Magic more generally, I think I had some high school buddies who played it, and I started playing there, got pretty hooked, and then had a break during the later parts of high school and early college, and then pretty soon into college, picked it back up, played a little bit of Commander, and then found the Limited Resources podcast and got really into drafting and then into Cube. And then I made my first Cube, and then the rest is history. All Cube all the time since then.
What was the first cube you built?
The first cube I built was it was definitely a binder cube. Back in the day, I didn't know much better, so I sort of built out a 360 list and was like, there needs to be this many cards in each color and they all have to overlap. And so I had like a little spreadsheet where I was like, here's my 5 blue-white cards that are going to be a mix of the token deck and of the flash deck. And I would try to fill out and like get every little bit of the spreadsheet aesthetic perfect. And then I went to a store and bought as much of it as I could, and we played with that. That cube's been technically in the same box for 5, 6 years now, but it doesn't look anything like it used to. But that was sort of my original project, was just binder cube.
Nice. Yeah, my first cube was my peasant cube, and we don't play it as often, but it does not look the same. I've foiled it all out. I think I could probably build a second cube or a third cube with all the cards that have come out of it at this point.
Oh, same. I mean, yeah, calling what is in the box that started the same is pointless. It's totally different.
Yes. And what do you do for work, and what are some of your hobbies outside of Magic?
As far as what I do for work, I'm a project manager for a sign company. So I handle signage projects both locally and a little bit on some national projects here and there. Nothing crazy though. Just working for an assortment of companies. We do, all kinds of outside signage. If you see a big sign on a building, that kind of stuff. As far as hobbies, I am big into climbing. I really enjoy climbing, and then a little bit of tennis and lots of magic and reading.
Pretty similar to me. I was pretty big into climbing last year. I was never very good. I was just getting onto the V3s. Then I took a break, and I used to play a lot of tennis in high school,
Oh yeah.
but now I actually have gotten really big into pickleball.
Oh, I've heard a lot of good things about it. I don't know anyone who plays though, which is important to play.
Yeah, I hadn't played it until a place opened up like 1 minute from my house, and I was like, I gotta check it out. And so I've been
Mm,
hooked since then.
sweet.
I say it every episode. If you happen to be in the area of Avon, Connecticut, that area, we cube every week at Games IRL. Come join us. We're always looking for new cube people. And if you're in Washington, reach out to Kellen. I bet you're always looking for new cubers too.
Oh yeah, we're always happy to have people. We specifically have a cube night in the Bothell area, but there are multiple events that sort of happen around, and I typically know who to talk to.
Yeah, sounds great. And today we have a really fun episode planned because we're talking about the Bolt Cube, which is funny because I actually built my own version of a Bolt Cube without having seen yours in the first place. I was just at my game store one day and we'd been all talking about building some weird cubes. And I said, what if players started at 3 life? And everyone in my store kind of laughed and said it's kind of silly. And of course, I took that as a challenge. And then we all went home that night and were thinking about it. And then I built a Bolt Cube. Sam built a Bolt Cube, and then Micah also built a Bolt Cube, all with slightly different rules. So my play group has a few Bolt Cubes, so I'm excited to go over how your construction is different than ours.
Yeah, yeah. I started similarly, except for that the initial version of this cube was actually what if we started at two?
Oh,
And maybe after about a year of curating it, I decided that three was like two, but a little bit better because there's just more creatures could be interesting threats without being instantly lethal. So I made that switch probably about a year into curating it.
yeah, and it's funny because when I was at CubeCon and I first brought the Bolt Cube, I was with Lincoln Davidson, and he played my Bolt Cube, and he thought it was really cool. And he said, "But what if it was a little different and one player started at 4 life and the other one was at 2, and it was the Char Cube?" Then he built the Char Cube. It's all
Interesting.
propagating into its own little genre.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's very interesting.
Yeah, and tell me about the construction of your cube.
Yeah, so I think that it's been through a lot of different changes, and I expect it might go to other ones. And a lot of it's sort of driven by the audience. So primarily it's played 1v1, but again, about a year ago, I made an adjustment to make it playable with 8 players. So the current size is to allow for 3 packs of 11 cards. Then the 1v1 is just drafting a smaller subset of that. The 1v1 version is drafted with a sort of a pick and burn and pass style that has a unique number set up for it. And then the 8 player version is drafted with cogwork librarians. Specifically, the cube was played primarily as a 1v1 for a long time. And one of the natures of this sort of pick and burn is there's these double picks that you do as you pass the packs back and forth. And with a lot of synergy that's in the cube, I found when you migrated to 8 players, you would lose some of that ability to sort of pick 2 cards that would work really well together. And so I introduced Cogwork Librarians to, as many other cubes have done, to sort of allow for those synergistic picks and double picks.
Yeah, I love Cogworth Librarian. I just love draft matter cards in general. Basically, all of my cubes, I include a Cogworth Librarian and a Lore Seeker.
Mm-hmm.
It's just so fun when somebody's like, I picked the Lore Seeker and then get the new pack. It's so fun.
Yeah.
And Cogwork sometimes it just gets passed between two people, and then somebody's like, why didn't I get the Cogwork yet? So it's definitely fun to have everyone get one. I've tried that before once, and I've definitely seen packs that had like five Cogworks in the same pack. So
Oh
definitely a
yeah.
cool idea.
Inevitably they end up writing packs at the end. That's one of the natures of the beast with that one. But I think that the overall effect on the draft is definitely worth kind of the weird birthday cogworks you get at the end.
Yes. I was actually playing a draft recently. It was an artifact cube, and they also had another draft matters card. I think it's called Canal Dredger or something. And it says at the end of the pack, everyone gets the last card of everyone's pack. That
Yeah. Mhm.
that one's also pretty interesting. But eventually I'll do a whole episode on draft matter cards. They're so fun. So your cube has 25 card decks. You start at 3 life, Bolt Cube,
Mhm.
and then it's drafted 3 packs of 11. You can also go above the 25 cards, right?
You can, yes.
So
It's
tell me
not
how you got that number.
so initially, I mean, when I first conceived the cube, I sort of the idea in my head was, well, 2 life, and then I just thought, okay, surrounding this, what if I just make all the numbers as small as possible in what my brain considered possible? So I think it was like 5 card hands, 20 card decks, 2 life, something like that. Immediately I realized the Magic plays terribly with 5 card hands, like 7 is a good number. So that changed. And then when it came to 20 card decks, it worked okay, but the nature of really low life formats is to have engaging games. There has to be a lot of interaction, and so you would run into a lot of situations where players would just trade out everything, and then someone would die to decking. And it was something in the like 30 to 40% of games that were ending with decking, natural decking, not like players intentionally trying to mill, but just naturally everyone would exchange resources. So 25 cards just negated the majority of those games, while keeping the deck small so that players can still find their individual synergies and stuff. Part of the goal of the smaller decks is to create these, unique decks that have interesting game plans and can usually access most of their cards. as opposed to 40 card decks where with Singleton, the odds of seeing an individual card, even over the course of a draft, sometimes you just won't see something you've put in there. That's really what drives that small number. And then, divisible by 5 is a good number. So 25 is where I settled, but it could be 24, 26, and it would have the same effect.
Sounds great. And my Bolt Cube is very different from yours because it's the same three life, but it's a 15 card deck, and players do not die for decking out. So
Mm-hmm.
players often run out of cards. But one thing that's also really different between ours is your cube is highly synergy based. You have this philosophy. I was reading it on your Cube Cobra page. Like creatures that cost one or two should not be able to really kill your opponent by itself without some sort of assistance. And
Mm-hmm.
then creatures that cost four or five, they can kill the opponent, but they have a big drawback compared to mine, where players can die turn one or two easy. That's a pretty common occurrence. So it's I kind of built it to be on purpose really fast gameplay, where yours,
Mm-hmm.
you're looking, it sounds like, from more normal gameplay with the three life.
Yeah, I think what I like about the low life formats for me, I'm someone who typically doesn't enjoy really high power formats. I just find them to be very swingy in games to end. And one of the things when you make a three life is by default, everything is kind of high power. I always joke that cards are impressive in this cube when they were almost not broken, but ended up being broken anyway. Like those are the cards that are interesting, but the list of cards that are broken is thousands and thousands of cards. Shock is just insanely degenerate. And so it's focusing on what can you get out of being at a low life total without making games incredibly swingy. And I think that the biggest thing is you really have to finally dial the balance of everything. But I think that what it lets you do is it lets you have really interesting synergies that are higher impact than normal. So there's a lot of cards that are very cool and it's very fun to do synergy things with. But at the end of the day, you get a 1/1, and like in a regular game of Magic, a 1/1 doesn't mean that much. But in this, it's if your payoff of, say, like assemble an artifact and enchantment and do something, get a 2/2 here. In regular Magic, it's like, okay, you got a 2/2, whatever. But here it's this equivalent of getting like a 14/2, right? So your synergies for the sort of little mechanical things just have much bigger payoffs. That's one advantage. And then I think the other advantage of being at a low life total is that it takes you right to that sort of intense end game, which is like a lot of what people really enjoy is sort of both people at a couple life and every play matters. And I think that this sort of fast forwards the game right to that point, which just makes for a really engaging mixture of fascinating, interesting synergies and like high intense gameplay. And so that's what I like about those low life formats, while sort of keeping it so that it's not just shock you're dead.
Yeah. Like 2 years ago, we both played each other's Bolt Cubes.
Mm-hmm.
You played mine, and I think your reaction was like, people are dying so fast. What's going on here? It was like, I'll play this 2-1 for one, and then I'll ping it, and then in response, I'll give it hexproof and +1/+1, and you're dead. And then turn two,
Mm-hmm.
and it's like, oh, over. Compared to when I played yours, I was like so used to my Bolt Cube, where I was like,
Mm-hmm.
it's turn two, and everyone's still at three life. What's going on here? And then it was like turn seven, and I'm like, I can't do anything. How do I kill my opponent? It was like this very strange paradigm. How have people reacted to this cube when they play it? Are they often like going into it thinking, oh, player started three life, I'll just kill him turn two, like often my Bolt Cube feels like? Or what are players' expectations versus their reality when you talk to them?
Well, I think a lot of it is about how you set up the expectations. So typically, the way I explain it is that it's you start at three life, but it's balanced. The way that I describe that is that the average deck will goldfish a kill on usually about turn five. Like if you were just attacking a blank 3 point life total, most decks can kill by turn five. Some aggro decks will kill on turn like 3 or 4. And that I think sets the tone for people. And the way I usually describe it is it's more about finding synergies in building engines and making sure that you have all the right interaction to line up against your opponent. And it's a bit more of a mental game that way of like, well, if we both were to flip up our decks, who would win, that sort of approach, and less of a, like blitz, you're dead. Although the nature of it being three life I learn when the cards are broken pretty quick because people just die, and I'm go, oh, okay, that card's too good. It's pretty easy to find.
It's pretty obvious.
Yeah, yeah, it doesn't take many tests usually to figure out if something's a little too good.
Yeah, and speaking of interaction, tell me about what the interaction looks like in this cube, because I've gone through a lot of trying to figure out what the most powerful should be, because there's a lot of piece of interaction that you wouldn't think would be very good, like in normal Magic, but in
Hmm.
here are really strong, like Moment of Craving is 1 and a black. Target creature gets -2/-2, and you gain 2 life. And
Hmm.
in normal Magic, that's fine. But in here, especially in like how your cube would be, where it's can be hard to deal damage to your opponent, that's almost doubling your life total. That's really powerful.
Yeah, so I mean that card as an example, I assume you play that in your cube.
Yeah,
I
I have that in
wouldn't.
mind because people
Yeah,
can just die much faster in mine. So
right.
the
Oh,
life
for
gain is
sure.
really important.
No, it totally makes sense. In mine, that it's difficult to swing life totals much at all, either down or up. And so that would be, I mean, very, very powerful in this cube. The closest I have a couple effects that gain 1 life tacked onto a removal spell. There's a new one from Foundations. It's
Yeah,
called
joust through, right?
Joust
I
Through,
want to
which
have
is,
that in mind too.
yeah, it's a very cool card. I was excited to see it because pretty much no card can swing 2 points of life. It's a little too strong. So they typically swing one. But yeah, as far as the interaction is concerned, it's generally all very efficient. And then there are some cards that would not normally be good that are quite good in this context. So power, toughness, switching effects, inside out or twisted image are examples of this. Are often just murders
Yeah, your
because
cube has like a lot of O3s that you have to pump
so
up.
many creatures have 0 power that twist image is just 1 blue destroy target creature, draw a card oftentimes, which is very, very good. And then there's also many of the effects are build arounds that are tacked onto artifacts or enchantments. So I often tell players that disenchants play like Doom Blades and sometimes even better than Doom Blades. So there's lots of efficient disenchants for that reason. One of the big philosophies with the cube is I really enjoy sort of that feeling of like the ability to answer things as a blue player with counter magic. If you put a lot of effects onto permanents, especially ones without haste, even when it comes to removals, like Soul Snare, for example, removes the creature, but you put it on the board. It then allows Disenchants to play a little bit like counter magic. So there are a lot of effects that are permanents, Soul Snare, Portable Hole, Spell Bombs, that sort of thing. And then a lot of Disenchants, and then you kind of get this like removal counter spell interaction, even in colors that aren't blue. Of course, there is also blue counter magic and a little bit that white has in Mana Tithe and Reprieve and such.
Yeah. One of my favorite pieces of interaction in mine is Swords to Plowshares
Yep.
because you can target the opponent and then sometimes they're gaining 2 life, which can be really bad. And I feel like this would especially be really bad in yours. But you can target your own thing and triple your life total sometimes, which is really fun.
Yep, swords is yeah, it's in my cube for the same reason. It's very interesting. It's a big cost to well, one have a creature with power and two exile it in my cube. But I think the recontextualization of it, it's very similar. Where if you target your opponent's stuff with 0 power, it's very good, and if you target your own stuff, you can gain life. So I just think it's so fascinating to see what is broadly considered the best removal spell in Magic be good, but also have like a very interesting drawback of having to think about it. You can't just snap it off.
Yeah, in this cube, it almost feels like a healing salve. Gain 3 life. That's insanely powerful. That's like gaining 20.
Yeah, exactly.
Tell me about the role of life gain in your cube. In my cube, because it's so much more swingy, I have a big role of life gain in mine because sometimes gaining 2, 3 life, that can only save you for 1 turn. Some decks in my cube often are try and gain life, stave off the insanely fast decks, and then late game have some sort of engine to survive so that when the opponent, only having a 15 card deck, runs out of resources to kill you quickly because their deck often is turbocharged and doesn't really have a late game plan, then you can have some sort of sometimes pretty funny way to win the game, like Chalice of Life, which is just 3 mana
Mm-hmm.
artifact, tap, gain a life. But then if you have 10 or more, then you can deal 5 to your opponent. So it's just an insta kill. So life
Yeah,
gain definitely has a big role in mine, but it sounds like it's not as much in yours.
not as much. There are a couple instances of it. Obviously, because it's harder to go up and down on life totals, cards that gain life are very good. I think there's probably somewhere in the ballpark of 7 of them. I know you, for example, have the tap lands that gain life. at least last time I played, and those
Yeah,
would be far too strong for this. There is a single Glimmer Post, which is colorless and gains life, and that card is quite good. And the colorless nature of it means it's a little bit of a cost because the deck sizes are so small, the number of lands you run is lower, and so there's kind of a consideration about whether or not you're it's worth the colorless land in your mana base, but for that one life. So a lot of the cards are like that, where they're almost solely dedicated to gaining life, and you kind of have to think about whether or not your deck needs that, because there's some sort of control decks that are very happy to have it, and other decks that really don't care that much. There is even some combinations. I think the most notable is probably Seery Meditation, which is a card that I love. It's this old Ravnica card. It's one white red for an enchantment. Whenever you gain life, you can pay 2 mana and deal 2 damage to any target.
that card is
Um,
awesome.
has
I
really
had
sweet
that
art
when I was a kid.
and is another yeah, it's a perfect example of one of those synergy cards that when I've seen it and I've wanted to play it in other cubes, but it's typically just so far below the bar. If you think about it, in this cube it's something like whenever you gain life, pay 2, deal 7, or deal 14 even. If you're contextualizing it against a 20 life total. And so it's just a very cool synergy piece, and like a great red white control payoff, that sort of thing. So that's what life gain does primarily, is feed into a couple synergy cards like that and be a buffer for control decks, and occasionally a game plan for some decks.
That sounds like a really fun way to do it. I also have, like you mentioned, that I have Radiant Fountain, which is enters untapped, you gain 2 life, but it only taps for colorless.
Mhm.
And so often people don't even play it in their deck because having the right colors of mana is so important. And gaining 2 life, if you lose tempo for 1 turn, is not very good. So the decks that
Uh-huh.
tend to play it are the ones that also have a lot of like bounce lands to keep returning it over and over again and to really get out of your opponent's range of killing you.
Goalkeeper is definitely slower in so much as that your life total isn't pressured, but opponents and yourself are typically snowballing to escalate synergies. So similarly, colorless, even though you may not fall behind quite literally, as like there's a 2-1 on board, your opponent will be able to be deploying synergy pieces and developing their game plan, and you have to be able to interact that or develop your own game plan to race and set up. So that colorless is similarly a cost in this environment. A little less probably than in yours, but it's significant.
One thing that's really interesting about your cube is it has such a low count of creatures. Often a red section in a cube could be 25 creatures out of like 50 or something, like 50% creatures.
Mm-hmm.
But in here, it's only 6 red creatures out of 39 red cards. How did
Yeah,
that happen?
the way that I sort of approach the cube in general is that players just really need to work to do anything. It's a cube where you have to solve a puzzle to win, and that includes creatures both in the draft and in the gameplay. To deal a damage to your opponent, you can't play 1 mana 1/1. You've got to play your row snacked Heir of Roga and then put a counter on it with something, or that's the approach. Among basically every resource is scarce, and so creatures is one of those resources. So all of the creatures are either essentially a vehicle for buffs of some kind, so 0 power creatures that can carry equipment or counters or temporary buffs from effects. They are some kind of synergy card. There's lots of cool build around creatures. One of my favorites is Biolume Egg from
Yeah.
Crimson Vow, which is a 2 and a blue for an 0/4 that when you sacrifice it comes back as a 4/4 that can like sacrifice islands to give itself unblockable. Very cool card. So there's a lot of build around creatures like that. The 0 power creatures that are sort of vehicles, then some mixture of a bit of reanimator targets for reanimator decks and other sort of interesting synergy creatures like looters or damage preventing cards, that sort of thing. Honestly, a lot of it is that there's only so many creatures in Magic that can do one of those things. I play almost all of the creatures in Magic that I think are viable and not like extremely redundant. So that's part of the reason why. And it's also to allow for lots of interaction and lots of like build around artifacts and enchantments. Those are kind of the reasons why the creature count's so low.
I guess it's pretty uncommon for them to print a red 0/1 for one.
It is quite rare. I also do have an aesthetic distaste for old border cards, so I typically avoid them. So that also limits a little bit of my options. There are more 0 power red cards in old border. Just
No kobolds?
there are some kobolds in here, but none of the old ones. There's some new ones that exist.
Oh yeah, I got Minion of the Mighty and
Yeah.
Roast Knocked.
Yeah, there's about four kobolds in here, but none of the old border ones.
Tell me about the role of burn in this cube because you do have red spells that can deal damage to creatures. You have plenty of those, like Torch the Tower, Unholy Heat, Abrade, but you don't have any direct damage to the face. Where in mine, I do have some. Like, for example, I have Gut Shot, which can
Hmm.
deal one to the opponent.
Yep.
I have Spark Jolt, which can deal one and scries one to the opponent. Mine does have burn, but I think in your cube it's a little different because in mine, only having 15 cards, dealing one to the opponent, if that's not relevant to the matchup, that's a big
Hmm.
cost in your deck.
Right, right.
Tell me about burn in your cube.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, burn as far as it is interacting with creatures is red's primary way of dealing damage, so those effects are going to exist. As far as going face, the promise that I'm trying to give with this particular cube is that to win the game, it's going to be sort of a struggle with your opponent as with their interaction and your threats, and then it's a puzzle to solve. And so, I think that if I, for example, have a 0/1 creature and I make my opponent jump through a hoop to put a counter on it, and then they attack and deal one damage, and then I turn around and gut shot them. It makes all of their work pretty irrelevant. So for that reason, I don't include any. And when I first designed the cube, eventually I had a spawning breath, which is one in a red, deal one, make an 0/1 spawn drowsy creature. The most recent one I had, probably about 6 months ago or so, was flick a coin, which is two in a red to draw a card, deal one damage to any target, and make a treasure. That card even was just too strong, or maybe not even strong so much as anticlimactic. Players would sort of have this game and they would be attacking each other, and finally someone would get whittled down to one, and it was like, and you're dead. And so for the kind of promise that these games have, I think that it ended up just being more frustrating and anticlimactic than interesting. So for that reason, I cut that card finally, and then since then I've just made a flat rule of no burn because I think that for the style of gameplay I'm going for, it doesn't create interesting games. It just sort of ends games early.
Yeah, that's a really interesting philosophy behind it. And the question that I've been asked the most about this cube is, oh, it's a bolt cube. Is bolt in there? So
Yeah,
I think people
that
expect a
is the
little bit of
classic
burn in my
question.
end.
Which, to be fair, it's a an issue of the naming convention of calling it Bolt Cube. Like, obviously, it makes sense once you understand the cube why it's called that, but it does. People do expect lightning bolts when they don't know what's going on, but obviously,
Yes.
far too good.
And tell me about some of the archetypes in the cube. In my cube, I do have archetypes, but it's not as, I would say, developed, mostly for a few reasons. I have a smaller sized list, so I can only fit in so many cards.
Mhm.
Two, the games go so much faster that it can be hard to develop some archetypes that can take up time to set up. But there are still some. Like, for example, in mine, I have some aristocrats, I have like prowess, I have life gain, some token decks. But for the most part, it's more smaller packages rather than an entire strategy. One thing that I also have in mine is Storm, which is pretty funny. Sometimes you just go
Mm-mm.
gut shot, bone saw, crow storm, and get 3/1/2 birds, which is pretty fun. And the opponent's like, how do I deal with that? Tell me
Yeah,
about some
that's
of the
pretty
archetypes
good.
in yours.
I think the driving philosophy for me is just creating interesting opportunities that you wouldn't see in normal games of Magic. And so I don't even necessarily think about them as archetypes so much as just packages of cards, because unlike what you would see in a traditional cube, say if you were going to go for a token strategy, you need sort of all of the cards in your deck to care about tokens. You can make like a 1/1 here, and that's kind of good enough. And so it's more about how many different overlapping packages of 1 to 2 cards, which I wouldn't even consider an archetype so much as just a combo in a way, but the yield is not Splendor Twin, it's a 1/1. And so I think that a lot of what I focus on is sort of how can I make a bunch of different includes of singular cards or sets of 3 to 4 cards that kind of all overlap. For example, there's Blacksmith Talent, which is 1 red for a class that makes a sword token, which is a equipment token that you can equip for 2 generic mana, and it gives +1/+1.
That
The
sounds
rest
pretty
of
strong.
Yeah, it is pretty strong. The rest of the class has like a bunch of mana to auto equip and then eventually grant double strike, something like 7 mana altogether. So it sort of gives you a late game engine. And obviously, it makes a token by itself that's pretty good. So that card is by itself an interesting threat. But there's also the side effect of, okay, it makes two permanents. And so, what can you do with those permanents? It also, makes an equipment which may trigger certain cards that care about that. The most interesting interaction I had with this recently is that it single-handedly is an enchantment and an artifact. And there's a really impactful spell, Banishing Slash, which is white
Ooh,
white,
yeah.
destroy target tapped creature, artifact, or enchantment. And if you control an artifact and enchantment, you make a 2/2. So this card single-handedly, you can play this on one and then play that on two, kill something of your opponents and make a 2/2,
That's really fun.
which is, really strong interaction. It's on the upper end of powerful things you can do. But that's an example of just two cards that kind of each have their own purpose and then together have this really impactful play pattern. And so I try to include just as many of those as possible. I have the card Dunes of the Dead, which is a land that when it is put into the graveyard makes a 2/2 zombie. And then there's all these different ways that you can sacrifice lands. And once I included that, I just looked and said, like, okay, what else is interesting? So there's a Flagstones of Trocare, which just finds a land when you do that. And so now there's, I've seen players play this white red lands based deck that has a Dune to the Dead, but has a Flagstones and is just like a white red controlling deck that's trying to ramp. I wouldn't really call that an archetype so much as just a utilizing of cards that mix with Dunes and then, other cards that benefit it. So that deck would play like an Oliphant, which is in here for being a reanimator target primarily, that is just also good in this deck that happens to be ramping because of these land cards like Cleansing Wildfire and Flagstones. It's just about finding cards that have as much mechanical little just intricacies that you can kind of sink your teeth into. So I try to avoid generic cards like Ponder or Preordain. I kind of want every card to have something to grab onto mechanically. So when players open a pack, they go, oh, how many ways do all of these things interact? I love liquid metal coating for this reason. It's a card that you can play with your own disenchants to destroy your opponent's permanents or with your own cards that benefit from having artifacts, with singular cards that care about your overall count. Just a lot of cool, unique interactions that I think when you're at 3 life, those interactions matter. When you're playing at 20, having a liquid metal coating, using it to make something one cheaper is often just not that impactful. Whereas here it can be very impactful.
Yeah, I combine all 5 pieces of Exodia and I get 2/1/1s, and the opponent's like, how do I deal with this?
Exactly.
In my list, I actually do have a couple full of infinites, but both of the cards are a little bit below the curve. Like, for example, I have Rosy Cotton and then
Hmm.
also Scurry Oak, and
Right.
those two together make an infinite. But Rosy's a 3 mana 1/1, so it can be pretty hard to get to that point in time. Also, Scurry Oak is a 3 mana 1/2. It can do some really explosive things, but you have to really build the deck around those because you're gonna probably die turn 2 if you're not ready.
Yep. No kidding. Well, I think that kind of thing makes a lot of sense when you have like a small deck. You're trying to assemble a specific combination that can get outside of the bounds of the life total paradigm entirely. So it makes sense to have something like that. Whereas here, typically, I don't include any infinites specifically because of the lack of large life swings. Scrapping for literally a 1/1 is pretty impactful by itself.
Tell me a little bit more about Reanimator in your queue. One of my other favorite cards that I have in my list is I actually have the card Reanimate because
Mm-hmm.
you can reanimate something really strong, but you'll lose a third of your life total. And then if you're a life gain deck, sometimes you have enough life that you can bring back a 3 drop or a 4 drop. Tell me about Reanimator in here.
Well, one, I would love to play Reanimate itself, but it has just proven to be not good, not good enough here. You just can't almost ever gain enough life for a card to be impactful by
It's
itself.
definitely a weird one.
Yeah. But I think that the Reanimate effects are a perfect example of my approach to making things have just multiple mechanical angles to bite at. Probably the strongest single reanimate spell is Late to Dinner, which, if people don't know, is 3 and a white to reanimate a creature from your graveyard and create a food token.
That's pretty strong, the food
Obviously, a
token
food
too.
token is very good. The food token by itself is can be strong enough to make the card playable, but of course, reanimating things is very good. The targets are typically not that crazy. I think that Oliphant is probably the premier reanimator target.
That's pretty big. That kills
It
the
is
opponent.
it is very big. It has trample and it kills the opponent, but it is also a 6/4, the 4 toughness being on the smaller end. The reason it's premier is because it can of course, bin itself, there is Chancellor of Annex, which is it's
Yeah,
probably the largest creature to reanimate, but of course it doesn't bin itself, so you have to find other ways to get it into the graveyard.
but it also has
Uh,
the reveal from your hand part.
it does, which is why it's in here is the combination of those two things. All told, there's probably 6 or 7 reanimator targets, but they're all, I mean, relatively anemic. They're sort of like 3 or 4 power creatures with cycling or the aforementioned Oliphant. The other best one is probably the blue creature Waker of Waves. People may be familiar with
Yeah,
that.
that
Also
seems
pitches
really
its
cool in here. The -1 -0 actually really matters.
yeah, very powerful. That one, of course, also pitches itself. So those are the threats. Largely speaking, there's a couple that are a little bit more dedicated, and then a bunch of them are sort of cycling cards that are useful for a bunch of different archetypes. The effects that reanimate are quite strong, and so there are not that many of them. I think there's about 4 in total. There's the late to dinner, which has the side effect of making an artifact token that has a really powerful ability, gaining life if you activate it. Of course, in 25 card decks, it takes quite a bit to get to 6 mana. So typically you have to cast the spell and then get your effect reanimated, not have it interacted with to then get that life yield. So there's a lot of play to it rather than just say gaining life when you cast it. I have in black Quest for Necropolis, which is a new Modern Horizons 3 card that I've been super happy with. It's an enchantment for 1 black. Whenever a land enters the battlefield, it gets a quest counter, and then you can spend 6 mana reduced by the number of quest counters on it to reanimate something.
That's fun.
It's another very cool one. The fact that it roughly is a reanimate for 3 to 4 mana usually, but gains counters, which allows you to proliferate to make it more cheap or more effective, or to use
Yeah,
those counters for other things. There's a couple cards here that use those counters. It's very cool. And then I have the Dimir Doppelganger, which is a 3 mana O2 creature, which already is okay. Like a 3 mana O2 is a reasonable stat line. Any creature that can carry power and toughness is already solid. But then it exiles cards from graveyards to become copies of those cards.
this
It's
card
very
brings me back
cool.
to conspiracy so much. That's so funny. This is like the card
Yeah.
you open, you were like, what is this?
Yeah, and a lot of people when they play look at the card and think it's not that powerful, but it has pretty consistently overperformed, being able to copy different things, both of yours and your opponents. In particular, it exiles cards from graveyards, which triggers some other synergy cards in the cube. Desecrated Tomb being a big one that makes
Yeah.
bats when cards leave the battlefield. So those are probably the 3 key reanimator effects. And I've mixed in other ones, but those are the ones I enjoy the most, all because they do the very powerful thing of reanimating. Really, your deck only needs one effect and then the ability to sort of protect and navigate the game to stick that effect when you do it. But also, they all have some of their sort of mechanical grip to them that makes them interesting cards in other non-reanimator decks.
And one other thing I wanted to talk about was we have very different lands in our cubes. Of
Mm-hmm.
course, my cube is smaller, so it has less lands. But we already mentioned that I have the gain life lands, which are really strong because they can
Mm-hmm.
gain life, they can do synergies with that. But in my cube, I land entering tapped is a big cost.
Yes.
And I don't actually have a lot of lands, really only a couple that can mana fix and enter untapped in mine. I also have the bounce lands, which, if you listen to a previous episode of the 15 card Highlander, we talked about in micro cubes, how bounce lands can be really powerful
Oh yeah,
because
for sure. They're very good.
you only have like 3 or 4 lands in your deck. In this cube, I've seen people play three, sometimes two if they're crazy.
Mm-hmm.
So a bounce land can really allow you to get to those higher mana costs. So I'm also playing around in like the micro cube space with that.
Right.
But your cube has basically all lands that can enter untapped. You have, which I think are so cool. I thought about putting in mine, but I haven't put in yet. The
Hmm.
Dustmorn lands that they
Yes.
enter tapped unless a player has 13 or less life. So that's very cool because both players start at 3. So those are just untapped lands. Then you also have the fast lands, which
Yep.
can, if you have 2 or fewer lands, enter.
Yep. Typically
But
enters
then
untapped.
yeah, and then you also have like the surveil lands, which I'm sure work really well for graveyard strategies.
Oh, they're great. Yeah.
And then also, it looks like more of like a broken land cycle at that point. Like you have one of the bridges for blue white, Razor Tide Bridge, but then you also
Yep.
have an isolated chapel. Tell me
Yeah,
about the
they're
lands. How did you pick them?
yeah, so I've gone through a couple different iterations on how I want to do it. Generally speaking, I have found the games to be more engaging when the fixing is good and has a purpose. The way that I've approached it One, I'm a big fan of providing my players with plentiful and good fixing in pretty much all of my cubes, and with one exception. But typically, I really enjoy like shock and fetch mana bases. Obviously, shock lands are just tap lands because
They would be
it's
pretty weird in here.
yeah. Essentially, you could never pay the 2 life. And similarly, fetch lands is just far too big of a cost. If your opponent paying 3 mana to deal you 1 damage is a little too good, you doing it for free, giving it to them for free is obviously terrible. So outside of that, then I had to decide what I wanted to include. The Duskmourn lands are a new addition. They're on the side of being too free. Obviously, always coming in untapped and providing 2 colors of mana is quite good. The reason I still do play them is because they are not typed. If they were typed duels, I would definitely not be playing them.
And they're also just
Um,
so cool. Like I feel like people see them in the pack and they say 13 or less life. Oh, it
yes,
feels just like such a big brain. Oh, these are
it,
perfect for this cube.
exactly. That has been a big draw, even though they're a little on the strong side for my taste. It is definitely like a very cool thing to have an environment that recontextualizes the cards to be strong in that way. So that was a pretty easy inclusion once those were, released a couple months ago. And then the Surveil lands were just slam dunks when they got printed. They're so cool. The Surveil is so much more impactful than a Scry. The fact that they're typed, there's a lot of effects in the cube that are very relevant that normally would find shock lands, but because you can't play them or they're very subpar, the Surveil lands sort of replace those as the like premier typed duel. So that's the role they kind of play. And then the fast lands are good early in the game and the sort of the next best thing, but they do have that cost as you go into the later game. And I enjoy those. So there's some decks that want a little bit more. That final cycle, the artifact lands are in all of the colors that have a reason to care. And then the last couple lands are check lands, which will check to see if you have a typed duel. Specifically, I chose those. Originally, I had a full cycle, but I started to integrate artifact lands. I chose to keep the couple of those check lands that I have to make the 13 or less life lands worse because they are not typed. So I wanted to reward players for playing lands that have land types, either basics or the surveil lands. So the check lands coming in untapped off of those incentivizes that direction a little bit more and weakens 13 or less lands a little.
Yeah, to have the 13 or left life loss lands. Those are really strong.
We
Those are such a tongue twist. This is impossiple to say. Oh
yeah,
my
we have to
God.
come up with a better name for those.
The triskaidekaphobia lands or whatever. That's not, it doesn't help.
I don't know if it helps, but I like the direction.
So tell me about some of your favorite decks that you've seen in this cube. Like, what are you looking for to be a really cool deck?
Players always ask me. It's very funny. They'll do something. They're like, "Oh, have you seen this before?" I'm like, "I've either seen about it or thought about it." Typically, when I add cards to the cube, I literally go over the entire list and consider every interaction because cards do become broken by nature of play this and then play this,
You have
and
to think
like
really hard about what you're
yeah,
including.
yeah. So I do have to like mull over the list typically and check against everything to make sure that it's not going to immediately break something. I'm usually aware of all of the potential interactions that exist, but it's very cool to see how mixtures of those packages will come together. So there's sort of some broad like common decks that you'll see. One of them is like one of the token engines plus a lot of interaction. Also, non-fixing lands are very strong. There's a lot of good land engines. Cards like Fountain Port,
Ooh, Fountainport is
the
cool.
yeah, Fountain Port or the White Castle, Castle Ardenvale are very good at, being like a consistent late game engine. So you kind of get control decks that use those as their payoffs. You'll get reanimator decks, of course, and then there'll be sort of these interesting mechanical decks that are based around certain cards. So one of the unique ones is Pia's Revolution. This is like among our playgroup a classic banger. It's whenever non-token artifact is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, return that card to your hand unless target opponent takes 3 damage.
That's
Obviously,
so
they're not
cool.
going to do that. So it basically means that you can kind of set up this like artifact deck that has just a bunch of infinite artifacts. The most notable is with Mishra's Bauble, you essentially build your own Necropotence where you can repeatedly crack Bauble to draw as many cards as you want. That's probably the closest thing to an infinite combo here. That deck is very
That's really
fun.
sweet. That's crazy.
There are mill decks that exist. Their enablers are terrible. I've had to nerf and nerf and nerf mill cards because the abilities are so strong. But one of the other side effects and ways to nerf mill cards that I've put in is cards that bottom things from your graveyard, like Tomb Trawler or Rito Lantern. These cards are you basically allow you to sort of recycle your library. So there's some very cool decks that are built around that. One of the neat interactions is the aforementioned Desecrated Tomb, which whenever a creature leaves your graveyard, you get a 1/1. If you bottom cards from your graveyard onto the bottom of your deck, it will trigger that. So there's been some very cool decks that are just built around sort of milling themselves and then, playing a lot of protection, just having essentially an infinite deck with Tomb Trawler and then generating their threats with Desecrated Tomb to make, a bunch of 1/1s and win that way. I think my personal favorite deck that I've drafted in the last stretch is a deck built around Simic Manipulator, which is one blue blue for an 0/1 with Evolve.
Yep.
Then tap, remove one or more +1/+1 counters from it, and gain control of a creature with power less than the number of counters. I played this in sort of a blue white deck that had, I think, three or four different effects that could like flicker it and put counters on it. Hallowed Respite or Parting Gust. These are essentially cards that flicker and put counters on things, which are good in the cube in general as buffs. If you exile your creature, bring it back with a counter, it's a threat. That's good enough. And so it was a deck that used that as in sort of this blue white shell with the Simic Manipulator and a couple other cards. And I was just able to repeatedly sort of trigger it and reset it up and rebuy it, recommission, which returns a small creature from the graveyard with a counter on it. I think I activated Simic Manipulator probably 6 or 7 times across the couple games I
Ooh.
played, which was the most I've ever seen that card do. But it felt just awesome to play that deck, and it's one of those cards where I haven't seen that card see play for a couple months, and then I was able to put that deck together and just win super convincingly with it. One of the things I enjoy about the cube is that oftentimes it's just a bunch of different tools and figuring out how to use all of those. And so, it had been a while, and then I found that deck. I wouldn't say is an archetype. I haven't seen someone drafted since, but that deck was, very impactful, very powerful when I put it together, and I had a blast playing it. I did also get to do my favorite thing, which I know makes me a monster, but I do really love playing liquid metal coating and shenanigans,
Ooh, that's
which
gross.
which is a dredge card that destroys an artifact, so you can kind of create a lock. So
Oh, blow up their lands.
yeah, in that blue white deck, I actually was using the conspiracy that allows you to fix one of your cards. So I was playing shenanigans as a colorless card essentially.
Gosh, that's disgusting.
Yeah, so that was a very fun deck. That's probably my highlight of recent ones that I've played. But I typically enjoy most decks that I draft because even if they're a little kind of scrappy and bad, the gameplay of trying to like solve the puzzle is always just so fun.
Simic Manipulator is a ton of fun. I have that in my Proliferate cube and just proliferating a ton of counters or doubling its counters and then stealing like a 5/5 when the opponent doesn't expect it is super sweet. So that card's a banger. And tell me about some of the cards from Foundations you are most excited about. We already mentioned Joust Through. I need to get a copy of that for mine too. That card's sweet.
Yeah, this game is very funny. When I look over new sets, I get often very few things. It's in particular now with how good Magic cards
Yeah,
are these
power
days.
creep. They
It's
can't make bad
hard.
cards anymore.
It's hard to find cards that are bad enough to include when it comes to the threat side. The interaction, sometimes I'll find a piece where I'm like, oh, this lines up nicely. But I'm always excited when I see something that is just truly terrible. And so we did get one with Foundations, which is Fishing Pole. um, it's one generic for an equipment that has equip for two. Then you can pay one and tap the equipped creature to put a bait counter on it. And then on this counter goes on the fishing pole, not on the creature. And then whenever the equipped creature becomes untapped, you can remove a bait counter and make a 1/1.
It's really good
So
at fishing.
yeah, exactly. So it's an equipment card that if you pay 4 mana and wait a turn, you'll get a 1/1, which is just like perfectly anemic for this cube. It's exactly what I want to see. It's
I like
great.
that
So
wording, perfectly anemic.
yeah, I always say that the threats are anemic and the interaction is excellent in this cube. So that's the dichotomy there. So fishing pole is very exciting. Yeah, joust through obviously was ironically the first instance of gain one life on a white card that was playable. I've been looking for one, but it's actually just a little hard to find cards that specifically say gain one life. There's lots of cards that gain one life every time you do something, but those are typically far too strong.
There's a bunch of cards that say gain 2 life also.
Yes, there are. Yeah, but I think it's just those two cards from Foundations. It was just Joust 3 and Fishing Pole. In recent times, I think the most exciting new addition to the cube from the last couple sets was Ghost Lantern from Duskmorn. That was a very cool new card. It's one generic for an artifact. You can tap and exile a card from a graveyard. Previously, I played Relic of Progenitus as a graveyard hate spell. So it sort of has that similar effect of being a graveyard hate effect. But then you can pay 6 mana and tap it, and sacrifice it, and put each creature exiled with it onto the battlefield as a 1/1. So it's kind of this cool engine where you can mill your own graveyard over and then tuck a bunch of creatures into Ghost Vacuum and then make this big army. Yeah, it's very cool, but it's very slow and inefficient, which is perfect again for the cube. My favorite thing is something that is telegraphed and accrues value and kind of lets you do something and makes little tiny creatures at the end of all of it, but takes a while. So fishing pole, ghost vacuum, my jam. That's exactly what I like to see.
Let's jump into a pack one, pick one here. We got a pack here.
Yeah, so we have everyone knows a braid, deal three or kill an artifact. We have force of negation, obviously the pitch blue force that's just a negate. We have Sensei's Divining Top, and then we've got two lands. We have a blue white artifact land, and then the red white 13 or less life land that we have not come up with a name for yet. Then we have some unusual cards. So we have Orochi Hatchery, which is XX comes into play. It's an artifact. When it comes into play, it has X charge counters on it. So if you pay 2 mana, it has one charge counter. 4 mana, it has two. And then you can pay 5 and tap it to put a 1/1 green snake token for each charge counter.
In normal
So
Magic, this card is so awful.
it is terrible. Here
It's
it's
like, what are you
pretty
paying?
good.
4 mana to get two counters, and you pay 5 to get two more, two one ones. You're paying 9 for two
Yeah,
of
I
them.
think the initial exchange is usually 9 mana for 2/1/1s.
Oh
But
my
here
gosh.
it's quite good. There are proliferate effects in the cube as well as sort of ways to grow it. So I've seen people play this out for 0 and then get it up to 3 or 4 charge counters and then activate it. So there's some cool synergies there. We've got Zektar Shrine Expedition, which is one in red for an enchantment with landfall. When a land enters, put a quest counter on it, and then you can remove 3 quest counters and sacrifice it for a 7/1 trample haste.
Ooh,
That one's pretty good in land decks, although it is a little slow and it's very telegraphed. So if your opponent has a way to answer a 7/1 at instant speed, they're usually pretty safe. There's Dusk Mantle, House of Shadows, which is land that taps for 1 generic, or you can spend blue black and tap to mill a player for 1. That's a very good mill win condition. Sarkhan the Mad, which is a 5 mana black red planeswalker with 7 loyalty. The relevant mode on this card is that it has -2 target creature's controller sacrifices it, and then you make a 5/5 dragon. It can also 0 for some card advantage and -4 to make dragons deal damage equal to their power to players.
that's pretty
So
strong.
it is pretty strong, but pretty slow and again pretty telegraphed. So this is kind of a payoff for like black red big mana deck that you'll see sometimes. And then the final card is Contingent Clasp, which is a -1/-1 counter, and then some Proliferate for 4 mana.
Yeah,
So
what are you thinking here?
yeah, so looking at the pack, there's nothing that stands out immediately as being insanely powerful here. So I would kind of be looking at two options, which is either setting up my mana or setting up my interaction suite. And so I would probably be between the Force of Negation and the red white 13 or less life land. Those are kind of what I'm looking at here. The one other option, which this is really not my playstyle, so I would not do this, but you could take a Dusk Mantle, House of Shadows, and
I
try
was
to
gonna
beat
say
my
I'm an
control
evil
deck.
person.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that is a very viable deck.
Only removal and then mill you out by 1. I'm a
Yep.
bad guy.
Yeah,
That
so I
sounds
would
really fun.
I would probably I love playing red white in this cube, so I would probably settle on the red white 13 or less land.
Very cool. The other card that I would consider is Sarkhan because he just seems really hard to deal with. You just get gum up the board and then get a 5/5, get a 5/5, and then the opponent's like, "How do you deal with that?" So that one, I think I'm between the Dusk Mantle and the Sarkhan.
Sweet.
And Kelvin, it's been a lot of fun having you on today's episode. Anything you want to say to the listeners before we wrap up?
I mean, if you're in the Seattle area, reach out for some cube. And if you're interested in a cube event, we're going to be hosting Washington Cube Champs 2. I don't have any specific details yet, but we'll be announcing those pretty soon if you're in the Seattle area or interested in traveling a little bit.
Around what time of year is that usually?
We're hoping for probably late Q1 or Q2 somewhere. Like I said, pretty vague at the moment, but we'll have more detailed information within the next couple weeks here.
I love cube events, so maybe I'll have to get out to that. And yeah, so great having you. And everyone, please subscribe, give us a 5-star rating, follow, all that stuff. I never know what to say here. And I hope you have a great day.
Thanks. See ya.